April 1945. The Pacific wind carried the metallic tang of rust and the stench of fuel oil. For the officers and men of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, the Battle of Okinawa, codenamed Operation Iceberg, was a long, suffocating nightmare. Here, just 350 miles from the Japanese home islands, lay the final threshold to Tokyo. And upon these waters, a frantic tactic defying all human instinct for survival was raging, the kamikaze. In the rolling swells about 30 nautical miles north of Okinawa, a brand new destroyer was slowly slicing through the dawn mist. She was the USS Laffey DD-724, an Allen M. Sumner-class destroyer. Viewed from the air, her slender hull carved a pristine white wake across the deep blue ocean. Unlike her predecessors, the Fletcher class, the Sumner class looked more compact and ferocious. Her main battery had evolved from single mounts to twin mounts. 3 twin 5-inch 38 caliber gun turrets gave her formidable firepower. The 2 super-firing turrets on her bow, in particular, resembled a boxer with fists raised, ready to strike. But at this moment, it was not bloodlust that permeated the ship, but a nerve-wracking silence. On the bridge, Commander Frederick Julian Beckton held his binoculars, scanning the northern horizon. He was not a tall man, standing only 5 feet 6 inches, but within that modest frame lay the grit and tenacity characteristic of an Arkansan. His face was bronzed by the Pacific sun, and the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes hid both a reverence for the sea and a desire to conquer it. Commander Beckton was no stranger to death. In 1943, he had commanded the USS Aaron Ward in the slaughterhouse of the Solomon Islands known as Iron Bottom Sound, fighting the Japanese until his ship sank beneath him. He was a survivor who had crawled back from hell. He knew the taste of losing a ship, and he had vowed never to let it happen again. "Captain, radar reports the airspace is clean," came the voice from the Combat Information Center, CIC, over the squawk box, laced with a rasp of exhaustion. Beckton lowered his binoculars and turned, his gaze sweeping over the young officers on the bridge. They all looked worn out, eyes sunken deep in their sockets. Since arriving in Okinawan waters, no one had slept soundly. The Laffey had been assigned to the most dangerous position of all, Radar Picket Station Number 1. It was a designation that made every destroyer captain shudder. To protect the main carrier groups and the landing fleet from sneak attacks by the Kamikaze Special Attack Corps, the U.S. military had established 16 radar picket stations around Okinawa. These stations were like the scouts of an ancient siege, posted alone at the very front. And Station Number 1, located at the northernmost tip of Okinawa, sat directly facing Kyushu, the primary launching base for the Kamikazes. In other words, the Laffey was a thorn stuck right in the Japanese eye and the first prey any southbound attack group would encounter. "Tell the boys to stay sharp, but don't snap." Beckton's voice was steady and powerful, possessing a magic that brought order to chaos. "The Japanese were quiet yesterday. I don't like it. That usually means they're saving up for something big." The executive officer, marking positions at the chart table, looked up with a bitter smile. "That Kikusui operation. Intel says they've prepared thousands of planes." Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. It was a variation of the imperial crest and the code name for this desperate suicide campaign. To the Japanese, it was the glory of dying for the emperor. To the 336 sailors on the Laffey, it meant the sky could rain down madmen at any moment, intent on dragging them and their ship to the bottom of the sea. Beckton stepped out onto the open bridge wing. The wind was strong, snapping the fabric of his khaki uniform. He looked at the sailors busy on the deck. Most were in their early 20s. Some faces still carried the softness of childhood. They were wiping the barrels of the 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns and checking the drums of the 20mm Oerlikon cannons. This ship was not just a killing machine. It was a home. It held farm boys from rural Arkansas, street hustlers from Brooklyn, and college students from California. Here they ate, slept, wrote letters, bragged, and awaited the judgment of fate. The Laffey was no recruit without a story. Though launched only a year prior, she already boasted a distinguished record. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, she had sat off Utah Beach, hammering German coastal defenses with precise fire, even taking a few German shells in return. She had then crossed half the globe to the Pacific, fighting in the Battle of Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima. But these waters were different. In Normandy, the Luftwaffe was all but extinct. In Okinawa, the sky belonged to the Grim Reaper. Commander Becton's fingers lightly traced the cold paint of the railing. He thought of the ship's namesake, Bartlett Laffey, a Civil War naval hero, and he thought of the previous destroyer named Laffey, DD-459, which had sacrificed itself in a heroic point-blank duel with the Japanese battleship Hiei in the dark waters of Guadalcanal. The name carries a destiny, Becton murmured to himself, but this time, the ending will be different. April 15, 1945, Sunday. The day was eerily quiet for radar picket station number 1. The sea was as flat as a mirror, with only the occasional dull thud of distant explosions reminding men that the war continued. Communications Officer Lieutenant Frank Manson sat in the cramped radio room, his headset filled with the crackle of static. He was one of the busiest men on board, responsible for fighter direction. As a radar picket, the Laffey was not just protecting herself, she was a miniature air traffic control tower. She had to use her powerful air search radar to detect incoming bogies and Vector Combat Air Patrol (CAP) fighters from the escort carriers to intercept them. "This is Laffey, calling Cap. Report position," Manson spoke into the microphone. A pilot's relaxed voice came through the headset. "This is Shamrock. We are at 20,000 feet overhead. Sun is bright. Visibility good. No flies in sight." Flies, their derogatory term for Japanese planes. Manson took off his headset and rubbed his throbbing temples. The calm only made him more anxious. Just days ago, nearby destroyers had been hammered. The USS Manert El Abele had been cut in half by a rocket-powered Oka suicide bomb and sank in minutes. "It feels like waiting for the other shoe to drop," Ensign Ari Futrides walked in, handing Manson a cup of coffee. He was another communications officer, Greek-American, and enviably optimistic. "I have a feeling, Ari." Manson took the coffee, the hot cup warming his cold fingers. "The Japanese won't let us sit comfortably at Station 1. If they don't blind us, their main force can't get through to the fleet in the south." Night fell. The Laffey went into total blackout. The ship merged into the inky darkness, save for the radar antenna spinning tirelessly atop the mast, emitting a faint hum. In the berthing compartments below deck, the atmosphere was oppressive. Sailors crowded into narrow bunks. Some were writing letters home, wondering if they would ever be mailed. Seaman Second Class Jim Towns was polishing his Lucky Charm, a piece of shrapnel he'd picked up on a Normandy beach under the red emergency light. He was a loader for Mount 53 on the aft deck. "Hey, Jim, how many do you think will come tomorrow?" A shipmate from the top bunk peeked over to ask. "How many what?" "Kamikazes, heard intel intercepted chatter. Tomorrow is the Emperor's birthday or some damn holiday. They're gonna go big." Jim stopped his polishing, his eyes going distant. "Just as long as they don't hit my turret. I told the chief as long as my gun can fire, I ain't leaving that damn seat." Mount 53 was one of Laffey's aces. It was the twin 5-inch mount located at the stern. In a surface engagement, it dealt with enemies behind them. In air defense, it bore the burden of protecting the ship's entire rear hemisphere. Jim and his gun crew were the hardest training group on the ship, capable of loading, aiming, and firing in seconds. Go to sleep. Jim shoved the shrapnel back into his pocket. Tomorrow's problems are for tomorrow. But he couldn't sleep. The whole ship seemed awake. The steel plates transmitted the sound of waves slapping the hull, like the heartbeat of some leviathan. Every sailor knew they were sitting on a live volcano named Laffey, and the Japanese held the fuse. In the captain's sea cabin, Becton wasn't sleeping either. By the light of a desk lamp, he was flipping through the crew roster. 336 names. 336 living, breathing souls. He remembered every face, remembered who had just become a father whose fiancée was waiting for him. As a commander, the cruelest part was not facing enemy fire, but knowing that your every order could turn a name on that list into a black line on a casualty report. He closed the folder, shut his eyes, and rehearsed tactical maneuvers in his mind over and over. Hard left rudder, hard right, emergency stop, back full. The Sumner class had twin rudders and twin screws. She was highly maneuverable. That might be their only salvation. April 16th, 1945, 7:55 a.m. The sun rose from the eastern horizon, dyeing the shimmering sea blood red. The weather was desperately beautiful. Visibility was unlimited, the sea calm, a gentle breeze blowing. It was a perfect day for a picture postcard. It was the worst possible day for air defense. There were no clouds to hide in. The warship on the azure ocean stood out like a steak on a dinner plate. The Laffey was already at general quarters. The alarm had screamed throughout the ship half an hour ago. Everyone was at their battle stations. Watertight doors were clamped shut, ventilation systems cut to prevent fire spread, and damage control parties stood ready in the passageways with fire extinguishers and shoring timber. Becton stood on the port wing of the bridge, wearing his steel helmet and life jacket. His eyes were as sharp as a hawk's. 8:08. The first blips appeared on the radar screen. The voice of the CIC officer grew urgent. Captain, radar contact, bearing 030, range 20 miles, many bogeys. My God, too many. Not one or two, not a dozen. The radar screen looked as if someone had thrown a handful of sesame seeds onto it. A dense swarm of blips was buzzing in from the north. Judging by the echoes, at least 50 enemy planes were diving toward radar picket station number 1. This was the beginning of Kikusui number 3. The Japanese had mustered the remaining elite of their Army and Navy air forces, attempting to drown the American line in sheer numbers. All batteries, release safety! Becton's order traveled through the voice tubes to the entire ship. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. At this moment, the Laffey was not entirely alone. Nearby was a landing craft support vessel, LCS-51, but the firepower of this small boat was negligible against such an onslaught. As for air cover, 4 FM-2 Wildcat fighters were rushing to the scene, but against the massive Japanese formation, they looked like 4 sparrows charging into a swarm of hornets. 0825. Visible black dots appeared on the horizon. Enemy aircraft, starboard side, the lookout screamed, his voice tearing. It was an Aichi D-3A Type 99 dive bomber, Allied codename Val. It didn't attack immediately, but circled just outside the range of Laffey's AA guns, as if assessing the prey or summoning its pack. Steady, Becton stared at the plane. Wait for him to enter range. Then more black dots appeared. Some flew high. Val's and Judy's, Yokosuka D-4Y Comet, setting up for dive bombing runs. Some hugged the water. Kate's, Nakajima B-5N, and Oscar's, Nakajima Key 43, attempting torpedo attacks or low-altitude ramming. It was a suicide squad composed of a motley collection of aircraft. Some couldn't even retract their landing gear, but they all shared one goal, to collide with the Laffey. 8:30. The gates of hell opened. Here they come! 4 valves suddenly broke from high altitude, splitting into 2 groups, one diving for the bow, one for the stern. Their engines emitted a high-pitched scream, the trumpet of the Grim Reaper's descent. "Hard right rudder, all ahead flank," Becton bellowed. The Laffey's massive hull leaned sharply to the right, her bow slicing the waves, kicking up white foam. "Commence firing! Fire at will!" In an instant, the entire warship erupted with a thunderous roar. The 3 twin 5-inch turrets boomed, blasting black clouds of flak into the sky. Then, the 12 barrels of the 40mm Bofors guns began their rhythmic thump-thump-thump, weaving a net of tracers. And at closer range, the 11 Oerlikon 20mm cannons screamed like chainsaws, spraying a dense rain of lead. The first diving Val had underestimated the fire density of a Sumner-class destroyer. Just as it entered its dive, the shockwave from a 5-inch proximity fuse near miss rattled its wings, followed by 40mm shells shredding its nose. Like a kite with a cut string, dragging a long tail of black smoke, it plunged into the sea less than 300 yards from the Laffey. The explosion sent a geyser of water dozens of meters high, splashing salty brine onto Becton's face. "Splash one!" A cheer went up on the bridge, but the cheers were cut short as the second plane punched through the defensive fire. Utilizing the smoke from the first explosion as cover, it skimmed almost directly over Laffey's mastheads. "Port side! Port side!" The plane dropped a bomb, but the pilot seemed too nervous. It landed in the water off the port bow. The massive shockwave rocked the Laffey violently, as if she had been shoved by a giant. Shrapnel rained against the hull like hail, making a terrifying clanging sound. "Damage report?" Becton gripped the railing to steady himself. "No flooding. All systems nominal." Before Becton could exhale, the radar operator's voice rang out again, trembling. "Captain, more incoming. Bearing 180, dead astern, and 090, starboard beam. Jesus, they're everywhere." Becton looked up. The once blue sky had turned into a slaughterhouse. A dozen Japanese planes circled like vultures, looking for angles of attack. The 4 brave wildcats were dogfighting with dozens of Zeros high above, trying to relieve pressure on the destroyer below, but too many were slipping through the net. An unprecedented hunt had begun. This was no ordinary air raid. It was an organized, frenzied execution. The Japanese pilots seemed to have singled out this lone destroyer. They attacked from all directions simultaneously, trying to overload Laffey's fire control system. No matter what happens, Becton looked at the impossibly young faces around him, eyes filled with terror, yet fingers clamped tight on triggers. As long as one gun fires, we do not abandon ship. It was an oath he would be tested on in mere minutes. Inside Mount 53, Jim Towns was sweating profusely as he humped shells. The turret interior reeked of acrid propellant and intense heat. "Faster! Move it!" the gun captain roared. Jim glanced through the sight port. The image he saw would be burned into his memory forever. A plane with the blood-red rising sun on its wings, diving straight for his turret, the pilot's white headband fluttering wildly in the wind. It wasn't a plane. It was a bomb with wings. "Damn it!" Jim shouted, ramming a 55-pound shell into the breach. "Go to hell!" Mount 53 kicked back violently, 2 massive balls of fire erupting from its barrels. The battle had only just begun. April 16th, 1945, 8:30 to 8:42. If the first few minutes were the Grim Reaper clearing his throat, radar picket station number 1 had now transformed into a chaotic heavy metal concert of death. The sky was no longer blue. It was choked with black puffs of flak, gray smoke from burning aviation fuel, and falling debris. Captain Becton stood on the bridge, his senses overloaded. Explosions to the left, screams to the right, the radio filled with the hysterical shouts of pilots and gun crews. 2, no, 3, port bow, bearing 270, low level. The Japanese had changed tactics. They were no longer dying one by one. They were attacking like a wolf pack, coordinating from multiple angles. 2 Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers skimmed the surface off the port side. They flew so low their prop wash traced ripples on the water. This low-level approach rendered Laffey's 5-inch main guns useless. They couldn't depress low enough, and the radar fire control struggled to lock onto targets hugging the waves. "Switch to local control, damn it, use your eyes," the gunnery officer screamed. Now the fate of the ship rested on the exposed gunners manning the 20mm and 40mm mounts on the open decks. At a portside 40mm Bofors mount, loader Pete Anderson felt his arms go numb. The 4-round clips were heavy, yet he had to slam them into the hopper every 2 seconds. The barrels were glowing hot from continuous fire, the paint blistering and releasing a pungent chemical smell. "Get him, get that bastard," the pointer roared, stomping on the firing pedal. Thump, 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 thump. The dull, rhythmic pounding of the Bofors felt like a hammer striking the chest. Tracers wove a wall of fire in front of the lead, Val. The pilot was clearly a veteran. He yanked the stick back, trying to hop over the barrage, but it was too late. A string of 40mm shells sawed his left wing off. The plane spun like a top, crashing into the sea just 50 yards from the hull. Debris swept across the deck like shrapnel. "Corpsman, man down here!" But there was no time for the wounded. The second Val was already upon them. This plane didn't choose to ram. Instead, it released a bomb. It detonated in the water, a massive geyser instantly swallowing the port side of the bridge. Seawater mixed with dead fish and steel fragments drenched Captain Becton. He wiped the brine from his face, not even blinking. "Hard right rudder, keep her moving." Becton knew that as long as the ship moved, they had a chance. If they stopped, the Laffey would become a floating coffin. However, the ferocity of the Japanese attack exceeded all imagination. At 8:42, a Val emerged from the chaos, using the smoke of burning wreckage as a screen to silently approach the stern. It didn't ram directly. At point-blank range, defensive fire shredded its elevator, but before the out-of-control plane crashed, its wing acted like a massive scythe, shearing across the starboard fantail. The sound of tearing metal was ear-splitting. The landing gear snapped communication antennas. The wing sliced off the shields of the 20mm guns. Though it ultimately crashed into the sea, it sprayed burning fuel across the deck, instantly igniting the starboard side. "Damage control, fire on the fantail." The flames began to spread, but this was merely the prelude to disaster. 8:45. For Jim Towns and his comrades in Mount 53, the world had shrunk to the inside of their turret. The exhaust fans whined, but failed to clear the thick propellant smoke. Throats burned, eyes watered. "Ammo. How much left?" "Still coming. Hoist is too slow." Mount 53, the twin 5-inch guns at the stern, was Laffey's strongest rear defense. Because of this, it was the primary target for the Japanese pilots. A D-4Y Judy dive bomber screamed down from high astern. Faster than the obsolete Val, its streamlined fuselage looked like a silver arrow. "Bearing 180, diving, diving." Jim heard the gun captain's desperate scream. The turret slewed wildly, trying to track the target. The Judy didn't ram. Harassed by fire from a support ship, the pilot pulled up at the last second. But he didn't fly away. He strafed the length of the Laffey from stern to bow. 7.7mm machine gun bullets rained down like hail. Sparks flew. Unprotected 20mm gunners were cut down like wheat. Blood instantly slicked the non-skid deck. But that wasn't the fatal blow. Close behind, another Val appeared. This pilot was committed to death. He didn't drop a bomb. He didn't strafe. He had one target, Mount 53. Jim Towns was shoving a shell into the tray when he felt the ship shudder violently, as if a giant hand had slammed it against the ocean floor. A deafening explosion drowned out everything. The Val, carrying a bomb and its own mass, slammed into the starboard side of Mount 53. The violent explosion tore the turret's armor open. Heat, shock waves, and burning aviation fuel flooded the interior. Ah! Screams echoed in the enclosed space. Jim felt a massive force throw him against the bulkhead, and his world went black. When he struggled to open his eyes, he saw hell. The inside of the turret was an inferno. The gun captain, who had been shouting orders moments ago, was slumped over the sight. Half his body dyed red. Loader's clothes were on fire. They thrashed and rolled in the cramped space. Fire! Put out the fire! Jim grabbed a CO2 extinguisher, but the white mist sputtering from the nozzle was pitiful against the roaring blaze. The suicide plane hadn't just destroyed Mount 53. Its bomb had blown a hole in the deck, severing hydraulic lines and communication cables to the rear. On the bridge, Becton watched a massive fireball rise from the stern, black smoke billowing. Mount 53 is not responding. Becton's heart sank. That was one of his heaviest hitters, but he couldn't stop to grieve. Control that fire. Keep it away from the magazine. Flood it. Flood the magazine if you have to. It was a painful decision. Flooding the magazine meant rendering the gun useless forever, but if he didn't, the whole ship would be blown to the heavens. 8:47 to 8:55. The Laffey was wounded. Her tail was burning, smoke obscuring visibility to the rear. But this only excited the enemy's bloodlust. Like sharks smelling blood, more planes circled in. In the next 8 minutes, the Laffey endured one of the most concentrated aerial assaults in modern naval history. The fourth plane, another Val, roared toward the burning stern. It seemed intent on finishing off the crippled Mount 53. Shoot him down, keep him back. The aft 20mm gunners, despite the raging fire nearby and the bodies of shipmates at their feet, clamped down on their triggers. The plane was turned into a sieve, crashing into the sea, just yards from the stern. But the bomb it carried broke free from momentum, skipping across the water and slamming into the ship just above the starboard propeller guard. The explosion shattered the hydraulic pumps in the steering room. "Captain, rudder is not responding," the helmsman reported in terror. "Jammed left 26 degrees. It was a death sentence. A destroyer without mobility is a sitting duck. The Laffey began to drive in a tight circle. This was normally a tactical taboo, but in this chaos, the crazy spin actually saved her. 2 Japanese planes rushing from the side anticipated the Laffey's straight course, only to miss as the ship veered sharply, plunging into the sea. But luck does not last forever. 8:52. The 5th plane arrived. A Val, heavily laden with a bomb. It approached cunningly from dead astern through the smoke, the blind spot of the AA defenses. Collision alarm! Collision alarm! This time, nothing could stop it. The plane plunged like a dagger into the afterdeck house. This was a command hub and housed officers' quarters. Boom! Wood splinters, steel plating, paperwork, and human remains were blasted outward. The explosion destroyed the aft damage control station, meaning firefighting and repair efforts in the rear were now paralyzed. Immediately, the 6th plane followed, slamming into almost the exact same spot. It was a meticulously designed double tap. The 1st plane tore open the armor, the 2nd detonated inside. The afterdeck house instantly became a massive incinerator. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air, turning the gloomy sky a sinister red. The rear of the Laffey was barely recognizable as a ship. It was a twisted mass of burning steel. On the bridge, Becton felt the deck beneath his feet growing scorching hot. Black smoke backdrafted through the vents, Everyone was coughing. Casualties? Aft damage control. Wiped out. The XO's voice cracked. Mount 53 wiped out. Mount 44 wiped out. After deckhouse. No signs of life. In just 20 minutes, the pristine destroyer had been reduced to scrap metal. Becton gripped the edge of the chart table, knuckles white. He looked out the window. The sea was littered with debris and oil slicks. On the horizon, more black dots were appearing. They weren't done yet. As long as we have one gun, as long as we have one man. Becton turned to face the young, terrified, soot-stained faces on the bridge. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the din of explosions. This ship will not sink. Do you understand? This ship will not sink. As long as I am here, as long as you are here. Below decks in the radio room, Lieutenant Frank Manson was screaming into his microphone. This is Laffey. We need support. Anybody that flies, get over here. We are surrounded. Repeat, we are surrounded. The headset crackled with the urgent response of a Wildcat pilot. Hang on, Laffey, we're coming. But the sky is full of zeros. We need time. We don't have time. Manson looked at the radar screen, covered in measles-like blips. Meanwhile, a miracle was happening near the Inferno at the stern. Ensign Ari Futrides, the communications officer, had found a fire hose. A desk officer by trade, he charged into the most dangerous zone. Anyone alive? He shouted into the smoke. Here. Beside the blackened wreck of Mount 53, a few figures stumbled up. It was Jim Towns. He was covered in blood, his clothes burned to rags, but he was still gripping the CO2 extinguisher. The turret is gone, Jim coughed, spitting up black, bloody phlegm. But I can still move. Where do you need me? Ari looked at the young man, his eyes welling up. This was why the ship hadn't sunk. Go to Mount 43, Ari pointed forward. Loaders are dead. They need hands. Aye, aye. Jim wiped the blood from his eyes and staggered toward the firing 40mm mount. In this moment, everyone on the ship, cooks, yeomen, machinists, became a warrior. There was no retreat. Behind them lay only the freezing Pacific. Their only chance of survival was to pull the trigger faster than the Reaper. 8:55. A piercing, unnatural shriek tore through the air. Portside. What is that? A strange-looking aircraft was skimming the waves. No propeller sound. Incredibly fast. Oka! That's an Oka suicide glider! The intelligence officer screamed. It was a rocket-powered manned bomb. Once launched, it was nearly impossible to intercept. The Manert L. Abele had been snapped in half by one of these just days before. Becton stared death in the face as the black dot grew rapidly. Concentrate fire, all port batteries, hit that damn rocket. Life and death hung in a single second. April 16th, 1945, 8:56. The high-speed object, identified in terror as an Oka missile, was actually a D-4Y Judy dive bomber stripped of all non-essential equipment to lighten its load. It sheared through the air like a meteor, straight for the Laffey's port beam. Commander Becton's heart nearly stopped. At this range, the main guns couldn't traverse fast enough. They had to rely on the light weapons. Just as doom seemed inevitable, a dark blue shadow swooped down from the heavens. It was an F-4U Corsair. Disregarding the Laffey's frantic spray-and-pray anti-aircraft fire, the fighter dove like a falcon protecting its nest, locking onto the tail of the Judy. Check fire! Check fire! Friendly in the line! The recognition officer screamed on the bridge. But it was an impossible order. The Laffey was surrounded by a wall of lead. Anything entering that sphere of death would be shredded. The Corsair pilot was either a madman or a hero. At less than 500 feet above the water, risking being shot down by his own side, he unleashed a long burst. 6.50 caliber machine guns pulverized the Judy's cockpit. The Japanese plane lost control less than 50 meters from the Laffey. Its left wing caught a wave, and the fuselage tumbled apart. Momentum hurled the engine like a cannonball against the Laffey's port hull plating. A sickening crunch echoed through the ship, but miraculously, it didn't penetrate. The Corsair pulled up at the very last second, practically grazing the Laffey's radar antenna. God bless that pilot. Becton exhaled sharply, but the reprieve was fleeting. Above, more American fighters, FM-2 Wildcats from the escort carrier USS Shamrock Bay and Corsairs from other carriers, joined the melee. The sky became a chaotic arena of aerial bayonet fighting. American pilots, desperate to save the destroyer, chased Japanese planes right into the Laffey's AA umbrella. The Japanese used this, luring American fighters into the ship's line of fire or forcing head-on collisions. "It's hell," Lieutenant Frank Manson watched from the window. "We're fighting the Japs and trying not to kill the guys saving us." 9 a.m. to 9:15 a.m. The battle entered its grimmest stalemate. Despite the air support, the Japanese still had the numbers. Like a tireless wolf pack, they tore at the wounded beast. The 7th Kamikaze, a Val, dove from high ahead. This time the target was the Laffey's eyes, the foremast. Mounts 71 and 72, the forward twin 5-inch guns, fired frantically. Proximity fuses detonated black clouds around the plane, but it wove through the shrapnel as if possessed. "Brace for impact!" Crash! The plane slammed into the starboard side of the foremast. Wood splinters, steel cables, and electronics sprayed everywhere. Though not causing mass casualties, the hit was catastrophic. The SG surface search radar and the SC air search radar antennas were obliterated. The mast hung precariously. "Radar is down. We are blind," CIC reported in despair. Without radar, the fire control system couldn't lock. The Laffey's state-of-the-art gunnery instantly regressed to the Napoleonic era, aiming by eye and gut instinct. Before the vibration stopped, the 8th plane arrived. It was an Oscar, flying insidiously low along the starboard side, under the depression angle of the main guns. Then it pulled up sharply, aiming for the bridge. Becton watched the plane fill his vision, seeing the pilot's contorted face. "Hard right rudder." The ship listed violently. The plane grazed the starboard signal flag bag and crashed into the cluster of 20mm guns on the starboard side. Burning gasoline instantly swallowed 2 gun mounts. Young sailors turned into human torches, screaming as they leaped into the sea or rolled in agony on the deck. The Laffey was now a broken toy, stern burning, amidships smoking, radar destroyed, comms spotty. Power failure, forward mounts have lost power. Bad news piled on bad news. Frequent explosions had severed main power cables. The heavy barrels of the forward 5-inch guns drooped, looking defeated. "Don't give up, switch to manual," the Mount 72 captain roared through the smoke. Manually operating a multi-ton turret to track aircraft sounded like fantasy, but driven by the instinct to survive, the sailors found superhuman strength. 2 burly loaders jumped onto the operator seats, cranking the hand wheels like madmen. "Left 2 turns! Elevate! Elevate!" Though slow as snails compared to the planes, they adopted a primal tactic: barrage fire. They fixed the guns on a likely approach path and pumped shells into that box of sky, creating a wall of death. Now, the true protagonists were the 20mm Oerlikon gunners, who needed no electricity. At a port side mount, Seaman 3rd Class Airy Grant saw nothing but red. His gun shield was pockmarked with shrapnel. His loader had just fallen to a stray bullet. He was alone. He used his knees to hold the mount steady, one hand swapping heavy drums, the other jamming the trigger. His palms were blistered from the heat, but he felt no pain. A Japanese plane tried to attack the ruined stern. Grant's gun roared, a stream of 20mm shells walking into the enemy's fuel tank. The plane blossomed into a brilliant firework. "Good kill, kid," someone shouted in the chaos. Grant couldn't hear. His ears had long since gone deaf from the roar. He just mechanically repeated the motion. Aim, fire, reload. 9:20. The Laffey was teetering on the edge. The stern had settled several feet. Water was pouring in through multiple holes. The fire on the fantail threatened to cook off the magazine. A young ensign, face bloody, stumbled onto the bridge. His eyes were unfocused, clearly at the breaking point. "Captain," his voice sobbed, "the rear is gone. Dead bodies everywhere. Should we abandon ship?" Silence fell over the bridge. Despite the war outside, the words "abandon ship" struck like thunder. For a sailor, losing the ship meant losing everything. But here, it seemed the only way out. Nearby destroyers were already closing in, ready to rescue survivors. Becton turned. His uniform was filthy with brine and soot, but his back was ramrod straight. He looked at the broken ensign, then at the officers waiting for his command. His gaze went through the shattered windows to the sailors manually cranking guns on the foredeck, to the damage control teams fighting fire with hoses. "No." Becton's voice wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable authority. "As long as there is one gun that can fire, I will not abandon ship." He paused, his eyes hardening to steel. "If you want to go, you can jump. But I am staying, and this ship is staying." The words were a shot of adrenaline. "You heard the captain!" the XO bellowed. "Get back to your posts! Put that damn fire out! Shoot those Japs down!" The ensign froze. He looked at Becton's profile, bowed his head in shame, then wiped his tears furiously. "Aye, sir. I'll organize a shoring party." The battle raged, but the Laffey's soul had returned. 9:25 to 9:30. The Japanese seemed to sense the ship's stubbornness. They launched their final, most desperate wave. This wasn't tactical, it was pure mutual destruction. The 9th plane, a Judy with a bomb, dove at the port side. Hit by AA fire and burning, it maintained its course. Impact! It slammed below Mount 43 on the port quarter. The bomb penetrated the deck and exploded in the officers' quarters. This blast severed the last electrical connections. The ship plunged into darkness, lit only by flickering fires. Immediately, the 10th plane arrived. It aimed for the already mangled stern. Its impact was precise, cutting right into the space above the steering gear room. Port shaft stopped. The Laffey slowed. She was now limping on only the starboard screw, a crippled giant. But in this moment of near-total despair, salvation arrived. On the horizon, dozens of F-6F Hellcat fighters from the big carriers roared in. Like angry wasps, they pounced on the remaining Japanese planes. Simultaneously, a minesweeper, USS Pioneer, AM-105, though often misidentified in retellings, fleet tugs and minesweepers assisted, braved the danger, pulling alongside to spray water on the Laffey's fires. "Look, who is that?" Becton pointed. A massive silhouette was cutting through the waves, another destroyer. "They're coming to help." Although the Laffey was now a wreck, 4 main guns destroyed, 2 radars gone, the fantail leveled, rudder jammed, flooding severe, she was still floating. On her mainmast, the star-spangled banner, blackened by smoke and torn by shrapnel, still snapped in the wind. The gunfire tapered off. The Japanese planes were either down, spent, or fleeing north, chased by Hellcats. Becton checked his watch. 9:47. The hellish battle had lasted exactly 80 minutes. "I think," Becton gripped the railing, feeling his legs go weak. "We made it, but it wasn't over." For the Laffey, a new battle was starting, the battle to keep the ship alive. Bringing this carcass of steel home would be Becton's next great challenge. April 16th, 1945, 10 a.m. When the drone of the last Japanese engine faded into the northern sky and the last Bofors gun ceased its shuddering, the Laffey fell into a silence that made the skin crawl. It was more terrifying than the noise. Moments ago, explosions and mechanical screams filled the air. Now, there was only the monotonous slap of water against the hull and the groan of wounded metal, steel beams warping in the heat, the keel creaking under unequal stress. Captain Becton slowly lowered his binoculars. His hands trembled, the physiological crash after the adrenaline dump. He tried to step down from the platform, but his legs felt filled with lead. He looked around. The destroyer, once as elegant and fierce as a greyhound, now looked like a rag doll torn apart by a pack of wild dogs. The superstructure was riddled with holes, some large enough to crawl through. The foremast hung broken like a snapped limb. Radar antennas were gone, replaced by a tangle of wires. But the stern was the worst. It was no longer part of a ship. It was a charred ruin. Mount 53 was twisted, its barrels pointing uselessly at the sky, a silent accusation against God. The teak deck was charcoal, covered in foam, oil, body parts, and aircraft wreckage. "Count the casualties," Becton's voice rasped like sandpaper. "Organize damage control. We're taking her home." The air was thick with a smell combining fuel, burnt rubber, gunpowder, and seared flesh. It was a suffocating stench that would haunt the survivors' nightmares for the rest of their lives. The XO approached, dried blood crusted on a cut on his cheek. "Captain, Chief Engineer reports only the starboard shaft is turning, and not for long. Rudder is hard jammed at 26 left. We can only spin in circles." "Then let her spin," Becton gritted his teeth. "As long as she spins, she floats." For the surviving sailors, the fight hadn't ended. The enemy had just changed. Fire was now the primary threat. The blaze on the fantail raged on, fed by too much fuel, wreckage, aviation gas, rubber life rafts, and unexploded ordnance. "Hoses, over here!" Damage control officers screamed orders. But the fire main had been severed in multiple places. Water pressure was pitiful. "Use submersible pumps, use buckets, use helmets." It was a primitive struggle. Sailors formed bucket brigades. Even the cooks rushed out, using soup pots to throw seawater on the flames. The danger zone was the magazine below Mount 53. Tons of high explosives sat directly beneath the inferno. The deck was glowing red, seawater hitting it instantly hissed into steam. If the magazine cooked off, the Laffey would vaporize into a million pieces. "Check the temp in the magazine," the damage control chief yelled. But the hatch was warped shut. Small, wiry sailors volunteered. With crowbars and axes, braving suffocating smoke, they smashed a gap. The heat inside was intense. Paint on the ammo cans was blistering. Flood it now." With flooding pipes broken, they shoved a hose down the vent. It was a bitter choice, ruining the ammunition and weighing down the already sinking stern. But survival demanded it. Just then, a support ship, the minesweeper USS DD-724, pulled alongside. "Laffey, we're putting water on you. Take cover." The Macomb's massive monitors sprayed powerful jets of water, arching like white dragons onto the Laffey's fantail. With this aid, the fire demon that had raged for 2 hours finally began to retreat. When the last flame died, the fantail was a black wasteland. Sailors collapsed in the standing water, gasping for air, faces masked in soot and tears. They had won, at least for now. Meanwhile, amidships in the wardroom, another silent war was waging. It had been converted into a triage center. Dining tables were pushed together and covered with white cloths, now stained crimson. The Laffey's medical officer, Lieutenant Matthew Darnell, looked like a butcher. His white smock was unrecognizable. "Next," the wounded poured in, some burned beyond recognition, some filled with shrapnel, some missing limbs. Morphine was running low. Plasma was running low. "Pressure! Hold pressure there!" Darnell shouted, operating under the dim glow of emergency lanterns. A young sailor lay on a table, abdomen sliced open. He was delirious, muttering, "Mom, my letter, the letter." Darnell's hands shook, but he forced them still. He had to suture the artery in minutes, or the boy would die on the table. "Doc, one more!" Corpsman carried in a stretcher. It was a gun captain, blinded by a flash, his face embedded with glass. "Leave me," he struggled. Help the kids first." The air here was heavier than on deck, filled with groans, prayers, and the rattle of dying breaths. Ari Foutrides walked in, looking for his men. Seeing the blood and severed limbs, the officer who had shown no fear in battle retched. He saw Jim Towns. The survivor of Mount 53 sat in a corner, arm heavily bandaged, staring into the void. "Jim?" Ari whispered. Jim didn't react. He was alive, but his soul seemed left behind in the burning turret. Dr. Darnell wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at Ari. "Let him be. Shell shock. Give him time." In the battle, 32 crewmen didn't make it. Their bodies were lined up in the port passageway, covered in blankets or ponchos. Every survivor who walked past paused to remove his cap. These men had been drinking coffee and joking about dates this morning. Now they were cold names. 1 p.m. fire out, flooding controlled. But the Laffey faced a crisis. The rudder was jammed. She couldn't sail straight. If a single Japanese plane returned, the immobile ship was dead. "We have to center the rudder," Becton ordered. Easier said than done. The steering room was wrecked, hydraulics dead. Even the manual wheel had been blown away. The chief engineer and mechanics dove into the semi-flooded steering compartment. Chest deep in oily water, they tried to winch the massive rudder post with chain falls. 1, 2, 3, heave! Minutes turned to hours. The multi-ton iron slab didn't budge. "No go, Captain. It's welded solid." Becton looked at the chart. The nearest safe anchorage, Karama Redo, was miles away. For a ship that could only turn in circles, it might as well have been on the moon. Then the LCS-51 signaled, "Can we try to tow you?" A tiny boat of a few hundred tons trying to tow a 3,000-ton destroyer was like an ant pulling an elephant. No other choice. Becton smiled grimly. "Try it." Cables were rigged. The LCS throttled up, smoking. The line went taut. The Laffey moved, then stubbornly veered left. No matter how hard the LCS pulled, the Laffey wanted to circle. Late in the afternoon, a real ocean tug, the USS Pacana ATF-108, arrived. The crew of the Pacana had seen it all, but the sight of the Laffey made them gasp. "Jesus, how is that thing floating?" the tug captain hailed. "It's a miracle." With the Pacana towing and the Laffey backing her starboard engine to counteract the turn, the scarred warship finally began to crawl south. Speed, a few knots. Sunset turned the Pacific gold and red, a heartbreakingly beautiful scene. Becton stood on the wreckage of the bridge, watching the tug's wake. "We're going home, boys," he whispered. "We're going home." Night fell again. No one slept. Though exhausted, fear kept them awake. In the dark, the Laffey was a ghost. She ran dark to avoid submarines. Below decks, faint emergency lights illuminated touching scenes. Sailors huddled together, sharing cold rations, beans, and hardtack. They passed cigarettes, the tiny red embers, the only comfort in the gloom. "Hey, remember that Jap who hit Mount 53? A voice spoke in the dark. "Bet he regretted it at the last second." "Why?" "Because he picked the wrong ship. He thought we'd sink. He was wrong." A low chuckle rippled through the group. The laugh of survivors, manic, relieved, and mournful. This disaster birthed countless heroes. Frank Manson in the radio room, the doctor in the blood-slicked wardroom, the anonymous loader cranking the gun by hand. But as Becton later wrote, there were no individual heroes that day. The entire ship was the hero. Every sailor who stood his ground, every steel plate that held, created this miracle. April 17th, morning. As the first light hit the water, Land appeared. Karama, the forward base. The harbor was packed with battleships, transports, and supply vessels. As the tug pulled the Laffey in, the bustling harbor fell silent. Sailors on every ship rushed to the rails. They stared at the wreck, superstructure shaved off, hull blackened, riding dangerously low. But she held her head high. On the stump of the mast, a fresh American flag whipped in the morning breeze. One ship blew its whistle, then a second, a third. Finally, every ship in the harbor, from massive battleships to tiny sweepers, sounded their horns. Woo! Woo! The deafening roar was the highest tribute to the ship that would not die. Becton stood on the bridge, listening to the thunderous welcome. The hard man, who hadn't blinked during 80 minutes of hell, finally let the tears fall. He turned to his ragtag, soot-stained crew and snapped a crisp salute. Well done, gentlemen. Welcome to Okinawa. April 17th, 1945. Evening. Karama anchorage. A light rain fell, as if the heavens were weeping for the battered ship. On the Laffey's torn port deck, a solemn ceremony was underway. 32 bodies, wrapped in white canvas, lay in neat rows on sliding boards. They were draped with the stars and stripes, the honor they died to defend. Captain Becton wore a borrowed, ill-fitting, clean uniform. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes sunken. He had aged 10 years overnight. He stood before the 300-odd survivors, bandaged, arms in slings, their uniforms still stained with oil and blood. No one spoke. Only the rain pattering on canvas and the sea lapping against the hull broke the silence. The chaplain's voice drifted through the heavy air. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Lord, receive these brave souls into your eternal peace. Becton watched the first board tilt. It was a young loader from Mount 53. 2 days ago, he had shown Becton a photo of his fiancée. Present arms. The rifle squad fired into the air. Crack, crack, crack. The sharp reports pierced the gloom. The canvas slid from under the flag, plunging into the cold Pacific. A brief splash of white foam swallowed by the deep blue. One by one. With every slide, the survivors flinched inside. Jim Towns stood in the ranks, tears and rain tracking through the soot on his face. He recited the names in his heart. He was alive, living for them. When the last body was committed to the deep, the bugler played taps. The mournful notes hung over the anchorage. In that moment, rank, hate, and fear evaporated. Only grief and a longing for peace remained. They haven't left, Becton whispered to the sea. They've just changed the watch. They will guard the deep forever. After bidding farewell, the Laffey began the long road home. First towed to Saipan for emergency patches. There, in dry dock, engineers were stunned by the damage. 4 bomb hits, 6 kamikaze crashes, countless bullet holes, warped keel, superstructure ruined. By Navy statistical models, a destroyer taking this punishment had a survival probability of less than 1%. She should have sunk 10 times over. A surveyor with 30 years of experience shook his head, taking off his glasses. What is holding her together? Becton patted the steel hull. The soul of the ship, and those boys who refused to die. After patches in Saipan and Hawaii, the Laffey steamed under her own power across the Pacific to the West Coast. May 24, 1945. When the Laffey slowly pulled into Todd shipyards in Seattle, Tacoma, she wasn't just a destroyer, she was a celebrity. Crowds lined the shore. Newspaper headlines shouted, "The ship that would not die comes home." People waved flags and threw streamers. But for the sailors, it was simply relief. They could finally sleep without alarms, without looking for black dots in the sky. Over the next few months, the Laffey was reborn. Workers cut away the burnt stern, plated new steel, installed new radar and guns. When she emerged, she looked brand new, stronger than ever. Though World War II ended, her mission didn't. Years later, the Korean War broke out. The Laffey answered the call. She fought well, and though she never faced another suicide swarm, the legacy of Okinawa, grit, tenacity, refusal to yield, was welded into her keel. She patrolled the Cold War gloom, hunted Soviet subs in the Mediterranean, and served during the Suez Crisis. Finally, in 1975, the 30-year veteran retired. Time marched on. 1981, Charleston, South Carolina. Patriots Point Naval and Maritime Museum. A gray warship sat quietly at the dock. The hull number DD-724 was painted crisp and white. Beside her loomed the massive aircraft carrier USS Yorktown. The Laffey hadn't been scrapped. She was saved, a museum ship to tell the story of that mad morning. One sunny afternoon, a white-haired old man walked shakily up the gangway, leaning on a cane. He wore a dark blue suit, ribbon bars for the Navy Cross, and Purple Heart pinned to his chest. It was Rear Admiral Frederick Julian Beckton. He touched the railing, his gaze sweeping the freshly painted deck. Tourists laughed and took photos, but he saw 1945. Here, Mount 53, where Jim Towns fought the devil. There, the after-deck house, where 2 planes took dozens of lives, and the bridge, where he swore never to abandon ship. A school group was visiting. A little boy with a Texas drawl pointed at a brass plaque. "Teacher, why do they call it the ship that would not die? It looks just like a normal boat." Beckton stopped and smiled at the boy. "Son," his voice was old but steady, "because this ship wasn't just made of steel. It was made of courage. Steel sinks. Courage doesn't." The boy nodded, eyes wide. Beckton walked on. He reached Mount 53 at the stern. A wreath lay there. He removed his hat and stood in silence. The wind blew across Charleston Harbor, whistling like the Pacific winds of old. "I brought her back, boys," Beckton whispered, "just like I promised." 2024, April 16th. Nearly 80 years have passed since the bloodbath. Most survivors are gone. Admiral Beckton has long since reported to the final duty station to rejoin his crew. But the Laffey remains. Modern naval tacticians still study the battle in disbelief. In an age without Aegis systems, without phalanx CIWS, without missiles, how did a destroyer survive 22 attacks with manual cranking and eyeballs? The answer isn't in the technical specs. It's in the Laffey's unofficial motto, "Stand by for the damn one." It was their attitude toward danger. Face it, defeat it. In that battle, the Laffey was more than a ship. She became the ultimate symbol of human will. She proved that when men of conviction stand united, they can defy the statistics of destruction and create miracles.